So chapter 4 is on land use controls. And again, at the beginning of every chapter, there's several vocabulary words. They're always good to use for study purposes, create your flashcards with, to lock in your memory, because it's something that you could see, again, on your quiz or your exams. And so the government's right to exercise control over land use is primarily through the police power. We talked about the police power in a prior chapter. It's one of the 4 governmental powers, and it's their power to regulate land use. Land use controls from the police power are, some of the examples are a master plan for the city, zoning laws, building codes, subdivision, regulations. And so when you think of police powers, please don't just think of the cops that are pulling you over because you're speeding or you're not making a complete stop at a stop sign. The master plan for the city is what's going to consider the growth or growth pattern, taking into consideration the social and economic factors of the city. It's really its guide for growth. One thing that the master plan wants to keep in mind is that they have this homogeneous or homogeneity where we have homes in neighborhoods that are compatible. If you go into what some people might call a cookie cutter type neighborhood or your starter home type neighborhood, you're going to see that most of the houses are similar in square footage, similar price range, and that would be an example of that homogeneous in the master plan. And it results in stable values for your housing market. The next 2 slides, we have residential and commercial. We have the R1 through R7, and you may have the definitions as well, whether you look them up online or you look in your book. And we have the same thing for commercial. O1 is for office, C1, C2, C3, or C is for commercial. So the R, whether it's R1, R2, all the way up to R7, that's residential. The O is office, and the C is commercial. And I'm going through that a little bit fast, but it's because you're not going to have to know those for your exam. It's not something that's going to come up. What I would like for you to remember, though, for your exam, especially when we talk about residential, is that these, whether it's classified as an R1 zoning or R7 zoning, it's going to have minimum square footage requirements, and it's going to have what's called setbacks. And how these setbacks work is, let's look at our neighborhood here. So we have our lots with our homes that are put on it, and our setbacks are going to be in the front, in the side, and the rear of the house. So we have what's called a front yard setback, a rear yard setback, and then our side yard or our side setbacks. And that's saying that anything within this distance here, we cannot have our improvement built on it, or our structure, our house. And so it's a good word to know as far as the definition goes. But if you have, let's say, a person, a buyer looking at a house, and this house has a garage on the side of it, and your buyer is looking to put a cement pad next to the garage because they want to put in a place to set their boat, you would need to find out what the side yard setbacks are to know if they can do that or not. And so from the lot lines, we have these setbacks that extend toward where we're going to put our house. If you also, another way to look at these setbacks is if I look at the front of the houses in these neighborhoods, they're pretty much flush. They're all set back from the street, pretty much the same distance. That's another example of these front yard setbacks. Conditional use or special use permits allow conversion or construction of special purpose property. And these special purpose properties, like a library that these special use permits are given to are going to have to be for the overall benefit of the community. Exclusionary zoning and inclusionary zoning are similar, and we just have to understand what inclusionary would be and exclusionary would mean. So inclusionary, that's going to include the most amount of people. So we're going to have our lots or our land prices available at the lowest dollar amount so we can include the largest group of people for purchasing homes or purchasing land. Exclusionary, we're going to have more restrictions. Our lots are going to be more expensive and more restrictive, so we're going to exclude and essentially allow a smaller group of people to be able to afford these land costs. Building moratorium. We saw the word moratorium in one of our other chapters, and moratorium is really just putting a halt or a freeze to something. And so if I have a building moratorium, I'm putting a halt or a freeze to building. Or sometimes a building moratorium is called a zoning freeze. And so if I look in neighborhoods, the city is growing very, very fast, and the city is concerned about the demand keeping up with the supply. If they start seeing the demand whittle away and we have less and less demand, but the construction continues to expand and expand and expand, the city may issue one of these building moratoriums to put a halt on new construction so that we can allow demand to catch up with the supply. An amendment is going to allow or permit zoning change. Non-conforming use is where we have a property that is currently being used in violation of the zoning laws, but it's okay. So an example of that would be, let's say we had a neighborhood with what's called spot zoning, where we have spots of the neighborhood that are zoned for commercial, and the rest of the neighborhood is zoned residential. And so in those little spots where we have some commercial zoning, somebody puts in a bakery. And so we have Bert's Bakery sitting in this residential neighborhood. Well, years later, the city comes in and changes the entire neighborhood or rezones the entire neighborhood residential. And so now we have this commercial bakery inside this residential neighborhood, and Bert's Bakery would be what's called grandfathered in, allowed to continue to operate even though they are non-conforming. Spot zoning is what I alluded to a little earlier, where we have a change of zoning for isolated properties or a particular spot that's inconsistent with existing regulations. So we have, like I said earlier, some commercial scattered in with some residential zoning. A variance would be allowed, or if somebody filed for a variance, they would have an exception to the zoning ordinance. So, for example, in this situation, let's say this lot line went like this, because we have our street up here. So now with the current setbacks, this house is going to be roughly in this area, and because of this sharp street that's jutting into this lot, the city is going to grant this homeowner or this person that's buying this land a variance. So instead of having to come up this far, they only have to come up this far for their setbacks. And instead of having setbacks to come in here, they might allow them to have setbacks to come in a little bit further, so they can position their house more in a central position on that lot, as opposed to having to have the inconvenience of having their house butting right up against that street. So easements are going to give you basically the right to enter somebody else's land. And in an easement, we have this right of ingress, which is the right to enter, and the right of egress, which is the right to exit. Easements can be created by law, they can be created by people, or they can be created by use. And they have to be in writing. There's two different types, and we're going to see examples of those up on the board. We have an easement appurtenant or an easement engross. And first off, this easement appurtenant is where we have one piece of land that's burdened for the benefit of another. So with this easement appurtenant, let's say we have this piece of ground, and homeowner A owns this entire piece, and they decide that they want to sell off a portion for B. B buys it, puts up their house. But B is landlocked. B now needs an easement so he can access the road because he is landlocked. And so an easement would be granted to B to access the main road to get out. And this easement is on A's land. So A grants B this easement so B can access the road, and so they're no longer landlocked. B, in this case, is going to be considered the dominant tenant, and A is the servient tenant. The dominant is the one that acquires the benefit or the gain. The servient is the one who has the encumbrance or that gives the easement. This easement is an encumbrance on the property. It's a burden on the property. And when B sells, if B ends up selling his house to owner C, this easement's going to transfer with it. It's going to run with the property. It's another thing. Who maintains the road? It depends on how that easement is written. Chances are it's going to be up to B to maintain the road, but easily B could demand that A take care of the road as well, since it's on A's land. So, because B is not purchasing this land, it's just this driveway is being granted to B, so it's still technically A's land. So B could argue that and say that A is going to have to maintain the property or maintain the driveway. An easement by reservation is where we have a right-of-way that's retained by the seller. And you could see that out in the country. Let's say I had a piece of property here that is landlocked, and the only way to get in is a driveway over here. And this is farm ground, and this farmer ends up selling off 3 lots that are right alongside the main road. Well, when he goes to finally sell this last lot, so this farmer goes to sell off these lots before he sells off this last and final lot, with this easement by reservation, he's going to reserve an easement for himself or herself so they can have access from the road to their farm ground. Otherwise, there's no way that they can get their machinery in to that landlocked farm ground. An easement by grant is where we have an owner of a subdivision that they grant an easement to the city or the local utility companies so they can access the power boxes, access the utility lines, the phone lines, and all those other items for purposes of servicing or installing that equipment. An easement by necessity is when an easement is given for a special need or special purpose. Typically, it's when we have a landlocked property like this one when it was sold. This would be an example of an easement by necessity. B, when they purchased, they needed a driveway, so that was granted. This property was landlocked. They received this easement of necessity. It can't be rescinded by the owner, by A. A cannot rescind that. Profit apprendre, which we looked at in the earlier chapter, that's when you sell off your subsurface rights to a third party and they come in and mine them out. Now, in this area of the state, there are gravel pits, for instance, where you'll see farmers selling off pasture ground to companies that will come in and mine out the gravel. So let's say that's what A's done in this area. They have this gravel pit, and they allow now access with an easement for the company who's mining out the gravel to come on their land. The pit is actually what's being sold off, the subsurface rights, but there has to be an easement granted so that the company that's mining it out can come in and exit, so the right of ingress and egress. An easement by prescription is something that we've seen earlier too. That's acquired by a long continuous use of another's property. An easement in gross belongs to an individual or a legal entity. We're not going to see that in this type of scenario. An easement in gross is going to be something like a billboard. Driving up and down the interstate, you'll see billboards that are on people's land. They're in pastures, they're on farm ground. That's an easement in gross. It involves only one tract of land, so there is no servient or dominant tenant. And that person with the billboard has what's called a license, for instance, in that easement in gross. So they have the privilege to enter the land of another and use it for that specific purpose of changing out the billboard, of doing maintenance on the billboard as well. You can see an easement in gross with the railroad, for instance, or gas lines that run through somebody's property. In an easement in gross, we have either a personal easement, which would be that billboard in the yard, and that terminates upon the death of the easement holder, or a commercial easement. A commercial easement would be that railroad or the gas line that's running. Easements terminate in different ways. It depends on the different easement that they would have. If it's an easement by prescription, it'd be where the property would be abandoned, no longer needed, the owner's not there. A dominant and servient tenant, such as this example, they would merge. So, for example, let's say A is single and B is single and they get married. So, no longer need the easement. The dominant tenant releases the right. So the dominant tenant no longer needs the driveway. Maybe they bought a helicopter so they can just fly right in and land. So they no longer need the driveway. Or maybe there was a road that was built over here, and now they can access the road that way and they can release that easement. Quiet title suit, that's how we, through the easement by prescription, that's how we get the property. Or the easement is no longer necessary. So over on this easement by reservation example that we had with the farmer, let's say the farmer ends up selling the rest of the farm ground to C. Let's say C buys it, and now C owns it all. So it's no longer necessary to have that easement. Encroachment is different than an encumbrance. And you can see, because they are similar, you could see them being used on a test to try and mess you up. But Encumbrance, remember, is what we have when we have an easement. It's a burden on the title. And an encroachment is when I have some of the owner's property infringing on my land. So if I have the owner's tree branches that are extending over onto my property line, that would be an example of an encroachment. Or if maybe the next door neighbor had a fence put in and it was put in on like 6 inches over onto my property line, that would be an example of an encroachment. And a survey would quickly eliminate any doubt as to whose property line or whose property is this on and whose isn't it on.